The morning air was thick with the noise of a bustling bus stand. Commuters, wrapped in their own worlds, hustled to catch the next bus, while others stood in clusters, chatting about the day ahead. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the exhaust fumes of vehicles honking and racing by. It was the usual morning chaos, a blend of impatience and anticipation, everyone rushing to start their day. But for some, this morning would take a drastic turn, changing their lives forever. Karen stood off to the side, her eyes darting around the scene as she tapped her foot impatiently. She wasn't like the others. The long wait was more than just an inconvenience, it was a reflection of her mounting frustrations. A woman used to control, Karen had little tolerance for anything that disrupted her routine, especially when her patience was already stretched thin. Her grip tightened around her purse as the minutes seemed to drag on, a tight coil of tension building inside her. And then, it happened. A bus, slightly ahead of schedule, pulled into the stand. But in the midst of the chaos, Karen saw it, an opening in the traffic just wide enough for her to slip through. She sped forward, only to have a large city bus cut her off, blocking her path. In that split second, something inside her snapped. Her pulse quickened, and an overwhelming sense of injustice took hold. She was cut off, humiliated in front of everyone, and that was something she wouldn't stand for. Little did anyone know that this was the moment that would change everything. Karen's life had always been a series of small battles, never quite monumental, but always enough to keep her on edge. Raised in a suburban neighborhood where image and reputation meant everything, Karen had learned early on that control was the key to surviving the chaos of the world. Her family, though not wealthy, had an unspoken expectation: be strong, be perfect, be in control. Her father, a stoic man, never showed weakness. Her mother, although kind, often reminded her that success came from keeping a tight grip on the reins. This philosophy had seeped into Karen's bones, until it became second nature to her. But life wasn't always kind to Karen. Despite her career as a successful marketing executive, she often felt like an outsider, surrounded by people who seemed to glide through life with ease while she had to fight for every inch. The pressure to maintain a facade of perfect composure was exhausting. Every inconvenience, every small disruption, was a direct assault on her well-ordered world. Her frustrations often built up behind a carefully constructed smile, and when they finally spilled over, they were powerful enough to damage everything in their path. And today, her patience had been tested to its limit. The morning had already been a series of minor annoyances. Her coffee had spilled, she was late to the bus stand, and the cloud cover made her feel claustrophobic. As she walked across the busy stand, her mind was racing with the many things left undone. Her thoughts flickered to the small victories she'd earned in life, her career success, her position in the community, and how it all felt like it was slipping away. A glance at the digital clock on the bus stand told her that her bus was running late, adding one more thing to the long list of things gone wrong. But it was the traffic that set her off. The bus, which she could just see in the distance, was creeping up behind her. She stepped to the curb, checking her phone anxiously for updates on the time. The moment she saw the bus approaching, she decided to move. A tight squeeze between two cars allowed her just enough space to step forward, but then it happened. The bus driver, without signaling or warning, veered into the space she had hoped to use to cross. It wasn't a small move, the driver had cut her off, intentionally, or so it seemed to her. The honking cars behind her didn't help, and Karen's heart began to race. She tried to take a deep breath, but the frustration boiled over. It wasn't just the bus, it was the universe itself, throwing constant obstacles her way. Karen's pulse quickened, and she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. Her mind began to spiral. How dare he? Does he think I'm invisible? He's doing this on purpose, he must be. As the bus continued to slowly roll toward the stand, Karen's anger grew with every inch it closed. She wasn't just angry at the driver for cutting her off, she was angry at the world for making her feel like she didn't matter. The world was always against her, always setting her up to fail, and now here was this bus driver, a man she would never see again, ruining her morning in the most ridiculous way. Her thoughts were clouded with irrationality, her fists clenched so tightly that her nails bit into her palms. She walked faster, almost as if trying to outrun the storm brewing inside her. Her chest tightened with each step. She could feel the sweat on her forehead now, not from the heat but from the surge of emotion she couldn't control. The crowd around her, waiting for their buses, was oblivious to the fire building in her chest. The bus rolled to a stop at the stand, and as the driver opened the doors, Karen strode forward, her feet hitting the ground with purpose. She was no longer just walking, she was marching toward the confrontation that would change everything. Her fingers gripped the edge of her purse, and she could feel her heart thumping in her ears. The passengers around her noticed the shift in her energy, their eyes darting toward her as she approached the front of the bus. Her feet stopped, inches away from the bus driver's seat. The man looked up, his expression indifferent, his face a blank slate that made Karen's blood boil even more. He had no idea what was coming, no idea that the smallest of actions would soon send this entire morning into chaos. "Excuse me." Karen's voice rang out, louder than she had intended, causing the passengers to shift uncomfortably. "You cut me off back there. You saw me trying to get through, and you just cut me off like I wasn't even there." Her words were sharp, more shrill than she had meant, but the anger she had held onto for so long now burst forth with an intensity she couldn't stop. The bus driver, still not quite processing the situation, glanced up at her, confusion crossing his face. "Ma'am, I didn't, no." Karen cut him off, her voice rising in fury. "You did it on purpose. I saw you. Do you think I'm just invisible? You don't get to treat people like this. You don't get to cut me off and just keep going like it doesn't matter." Her words were spilling out, unrestrained, and she didn't care about the onlookers now. She only saw him, the man who had wronged her. Her voice was full of venom now, her whole body shaking with anger. "I am finally taking control," she thought. A few of the passengers glanced nervously at each other, unsure how to react. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared to speak up. They were all waiting for the storm to either subside or escalate. But for Karen, there was no turning back now. She had crossed the line. She was already too far gone, too deep in her rage to see reason. The bus driver, still staring at Karen, seemed almost oblivious to the storm he had just stirred. His response was slow, calm, trying to de-escalate the situation, but it only served to anger Karen more. He wasn't seeing her, he wasn't hearing her. Her mind was consumed with the injustice of it all. She had tried to be patient, tried to stay calm, but this man, this stranger, had humiliated her in front of everyone. She had felt invisible, dismissed, and it stung in a way that was unbearable. "Don't you dare dismiss me," she shouted, stepping closer to the driver's seat, her face contorted with rage. The world around her was growing smaller, nothing existed outside of this moment, outside of her fury. It was as if she had lost the ability to hear anything but her own voice, rising in volume with every passing second. The crowd around her had gone still, watching the confrontation with wide eyes, some whispering, others standing frozen. The tension was suffocating. "Ma'am, I didn't cut you off on purpose," the bus driver replied, his voice calm but firm, as if trying to talk sense into a person who had lost all sense of reason. "We all make mistakes. Just take a step back. Take a step back." The words cut through her like a razor, slicing through her fragile control. Was he seriously trying to minimize what had happened? This was not a mistake, it was a provocation. It was intentional, it was cruel, and it had been the last straw. In one swift motion, Karen's hand shot into her purse, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the gun hidden inside. She barely recognized the feeling, as if the decision had been made by someone else entirely. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the gun felt like an extension of her fury. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of what she was about to do crashing into her. But that moment was brief, too brief, and in the next second, the gun was out, pointed straight at the driver. A collective gasp echoed from the crowd, but Karen's vision blurred as everything narrowed down to the bus driver's face. His eyes widened in shock as he looked at the gun in her hand. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "Don't tell me what to do," she screamed, her voice a mixture of disbelief, fury, and a deep sense of humiliation. "I'm sick of being treated like this." The words were raw, unfiltered, and they hung in the air for a moment that felt like eternity. The crowd around them was paralyzed, no one moved, no one could breathe. They were watching a woman at the breaking point, a woman whose world had unraveled in the blink of an eye. The noise of the bustling bus stand, the honking of vehicles, the murmur of commuters, none of it mattered now. It was just Karen, the gun, and the driver. Then came the shot. The sound shattered the silence, ringing in her ears like a bell that couldn't be undone. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the bus stand, sharp and clear, and in that instant, everything froze. Time slowed. The bus driver's body jerked back as the bullet struck him, his eyes widening in pain and shock as he collapsed forward, crumpling to the floor of the bus with a sickening thud. The world around Karen seemed to collapse into a fog. She stood there, her hands trembling, still gripping the gun. The sound of the gunshot was still echoing in her head, drowning out everything else. The passengers, who had been standing in stunned silence, erupted into chaos. Some screamed and ran in all directions, their panic spreading like wildfire. Others stood frozen in disbelief, unable to process what had just happened. Karen's legs felt weak beneath her, and for a moment, she swayed on the spot, the weight of what she had just done settling in. The gun still felt heavy in her hand, but her grip was no longer firm. It felt like a stranger's weapon, like she was holding something that didn't belong to her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the world spun around her. She could hear the frantic cries of the people around her, the shuffling of feet as they rushed to escape the scene, but all of it seemed distant, like a dream she couldn't wake up from. Karen's eyes locked onto the crumpled form of the bus driver, lying motionless on the floor. His blood was starting to pool beneath him, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene around her. For a moment, the anger that had propelled her to this point began to fade, replaced by a terrible, gnawing emptiness. What had I just done? Her body felt like it was no longer her own. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet as she tried to process the enormity of the moment. A million thoughts raced through her mind, but none of them made sense. The clarity of the shot, the sound of the gunshot still ringing in her ears, began to dull as something deeper started to creep in. It was as if her mind had split into two halves. One was still consumed by the anger that had led to this, but the other half was beginning to understand the consequences of her actions. She could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. In a panic, she turned the gun toward the ground, holding it loosely in her hand as the weight of the situation hit her like a brick wall. She had crossed a line. No one would ever look at her the same way again. Her world, once so tightly controlled, was now shattered beyond repair. As Karen stood there, her body shaking with the aftermath of her actions, her mind wandered back to the years of frustration, the moments when she had felt overlooked, silenced, insignificant. The years of being ignored, of being told to take a step back when all she wanted was to be seen. Was this all it took for her to finally feel heard? Was this the price she had to pay for the years of hurt, the years of being invisible in a world that never seemed to care? Her thoughts were clouded, but one thing was clear: the moment she pulled the trigger, her life had changed forever. The blaring sirens grew louder as the first police car arrived at the bus stand, followed by a second, then a third. Karen stood motionless, her gun still loosely clutched in her hand. The chaos around her was growing, but in that moment, it felt as though everything was happening in slow motion. The sharp wail of the sirens, the shouts of officers, the frantic calls to paramedics, none of it seemed real. The world around her seemed distant, as though she were watching from a far-off place, detached from the nightmare she had just set into motion. "Drop the weapon," a police officer shouted, his voice cutting through the confusion. Karen's hands trembled, and her knees buckled beneath her. Slowly, she released the gun, letting it fall to the ground with a dull thud. Her fingers were still numb, and her chest felt as though it were being crushed under the weight of her own actions. The police quickly swarmed around her, their movements swift and practiced. They handcuffed her, her wrists feeling impossibly tight as the cold metal of the cuffs dug into her skin. Her mind was foggy, still trying to process what had just happened. But it was too late to take it back. As she was led to the police car, she could hear the murmurs of the crowd. Some were still in shock, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Others were openly condemning her, calling her every name imaginable. Karen's head hung low, her thoughts spinning, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a way to escape the nightmare she had created. The bus driver's body was already being attended to by paramedics, his condition unknown, but the bleeding was significant. The waiting game had begun. Inside the back of the police car, the door slammed shut, and Karen was left alone with her thoughts. Her breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The moments leading up to the shooting replayed in her mind like a haunting loop. She had acted out of pure rage, driven by years of feeling overlooked and unheard. It had been a release, a moment where she felt like she finally took control, but now that control felt more like a curse. At first, she didn't feel remorse. In the car, her thoughts were defensive, justifying her actions. He cut me off. He humiliated me in front of everyone. It was the only way to make him see me, to make him pay for what he did. But the more she thought about it, the more questions began to creep in. Was it really about the bus driver? Or was it about everything else that had built up inside me? The world outside the police car felt distant. Her vision blurred as she tried to piece together the events of the day, but her mind kept returning to one thought: did I have the right to do that? There was a strange sense of emptiness in her gut. Was she justified? Or was she just a product of her own emotions, a person too overwhelmed by life's frustrations to handle them? The clarity she had once felt when she pulled the trigger was slipping away, replaced with doubt. Karen's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing in her pocket. The officers had confiscated her belongings, but someone had already begun to text her. It was a message from her mother. "Karen, what happened? I saw the news. Are you okay?" The words were simple, but they hit her like a wave of cold water. Her mother had always expected her to be strong, to be in control. But now, Karen realized, she had just shattered everything that was once solid in her life. News of the incident spread like wildfire, and soon, the local news stations were covering the story. Headlines flashed across the screen: "Woman shoots bus driver in rage-fueled outburst." The video footage, taken by a bystander, went viral. The images of Karen standing over the unconscious driver, the gun in her hand, and the frantic crowd of witnesses, painted a picture of a woman driven to the edge. The media quickly picked up on the story, framing it as an example of the growing anger and frustration that many people felt in a world that was increasingly unpredictable. But public opinion was divided. Some sympathized with Karen, viewing her as a victim of a society that constantly ignored her. They spoke about the pressures of modern life, the traffic, the stress, the endless expectations, and how people like Karen were often left with no outlet for their anger. These voices called for understanding, for compassion, suggesting that perhaps the real issue was the growing sense of helplessness people felt when they couldn't control their surroundings. But others were not so forgiving. To them, Karen was nothing more than a villain, someone who let a trivial incident spiral into a life-or-death situation. They saw her as a person who, rather than dealing with her emotions in a healthy way, let anger consume her and take the life of another. To them, there was no excuse, no justification for what she had done. Karen's family, too, was thrown into turmoil. Her mother, who had always prided herself on raising a strong, successful daughter, was left speechless. Karen's friends had never seen this side of her. To them, Karen had always been composed, the one who handled everything with grace. They didn't understand how it all unraveled so quickly, how the woman they knew could snap under the weight of her frustrations. As Karen sat in the back of the police car, the harsh lights of the news cameras flashing through the windows, she realized that the world had already begun to judge her. Some saw her as a symbol of the societal pressures that led to her breakdown, while others saw her as a cautionary tale of the consequences of losing control. There was no turning back now. The officer's voice broke through her thoughts as they arrived at the station. "You'll be booked, and we'll get you a lawyer. The driver's still in critical condition, but you'll be facing charges either way." Karen nodded blankly, her mind still struggling to catch up with the reality of her actions. It was in that moment, as the police officers led her inside, that Karen truly understood. No matter how she tried to explain it, no matter how much she wanted to justify it, what had happened was irreversible. And the world would never see her the same way again. The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial of Karen Evans began. The once bustling, energetic woman who had commanded respect in her career, now sat quietly, her face pale and drained of the confidence that had once defined her. The sharp clack of the judge's gavel echoed through the room, signaling the start of the proceedings, but Karen's mind was somewhere far away, still stuck in that moment at the bus stand, the moment that had destroyed everything she had ever worked for. Her lawyer, a seasoned criminal defense attorney, was at her side, carefully preparing for the battle ahead. But Karen knew there was no way to prepare for this. Her actions were too public, too extreme. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Witnesses had come forward, many of them with video footage of the shooting. The images were everywhere, on social media, in the news, on every screen. It wasn't just a crime. It was a spectacle. The prosecution, led by a determined district attorney, painted Karen as a woman who had succumbed to the pressures of modern society, but had crossed a line. They described her as a person who had failed to control her anger, who had let a trivial traffic incident spiral into a deadly confrontation. The prosecution's case was clear: Karen had pulled the trigger in a moment of rage and without justification. But Karen's defense team argued a different narrative. They spoke of her mental state, of the emotional toll of a lifetime of pressure, the constant battle to maintain control, to keep it all together. They presented expert testimony from psychologists who suggested that Karen was suffering from an acute emotional breakdown, exacerbated by years of pent-up stress and frustration. They argued that Karen wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but rather a victim of a system that had ignored her needs. The trial dragged on for weeks, the tension building with each passing day. Karen sat silently in the defendant's chair, her eyes red from sleepless nights and the weight of her guilt. The evidence was clear: she had shot the bus driver. But was it premeditated? Was she truly responsible, or was she the product of a society that had failed her? Meanwhile, the public's reaction to the case was just as divided. The media had seized upon the trial, using Karen's story as a vehicle for larger discussions about mental health, societal pressures, and the dangers of unchecked rage. Many saw her as a symbol of the broken system, a woman who had been pushed too far by a world that demanded too much, too fast. Some viewers sympathized with Karen, believing that the underlying issues of stress and emotional overload were enough to explain her actions. On the other hand, there were those who saw Karen as a criminal who deserved the full weight of the law. The image of her holding the gun at the bus stand, cold and unflinching, was burned into the minds of many. To them, there was no excuse for taking someone's life over a traffic incident. Anger, no matter how justified, could not be an excuse for violence. As the trial neared its conclusion, Karen's fate hung in the balance. The defense hoped for a reduced sentence, a chance for Karen to seek therapy and rehabilitation instead of jail time. They argued that she had shown remorse, that she was not a threat to society, but a woman in desperate need of help. The prosecution, however, was determined to make an example of her. They pushed for a harsh sentence, hoping to send a message that actions like Karen's could not be excused, no matter the circumstances. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, called the court to order. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice gravely serious, "you have heard all the evidence. You are charged with determining the defendant's guilt or innocence. You must decide whether Karen Evans is responsible for the death of the victim, and if so, what the appropriate penalty should be." The jury deliberated for hours, their decision echoing through the courthouse like a drumbeat. Finally, they returned with their verdict. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge read the decision aloud. "On the charge of manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. However, due to the circumstances of the crime, including the defendant's emotional state and the pressures that led to the incident, the court will impose a sentence of 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. The defendant is also required to undergo psychological counseling and anger management therapy." The room seemed to hold its breath. Karen's heart sank, and she could feel a cold chill sweeping over her. She wasn't free, but neither was she facing the full wrath of the law. It was a compromise, one that gave her a chance for redemption, but at a heavy cost. Karen was led away in handcuffs, the weight of her actions settling in with each step. She had taken a life, and nothing could change that. But as she walked out of the courtroom, her thoughts turned inward. She had never imagined that her life would come to this, that a single moment of rage could destroy everything she had built. The road ahead was uncertain. She would serve her time, face her own demons, and attempt to rebuild the shattered pieces of her life. But she would never forget the consequences of losing control, of allowing anger to take over. In the end, Karen had been a victim of her own emotions, and now it was time for her to learn how to live with the consequences. The world would move on, the headlines fading, but Karen's journey of self-discovery and redemption had just begun. As the dust settles and Karen's story comes to an end, we are left to reflect on the consequences of unbridled anger and rash decisions. In a world full of misunderstandings, where do we draw the line between justice and vengeance? What happens when our emotions take control and cloud our judgment? Karen's story is a stark reminder of the fragile line between right and wrong, and how easily it can be crossed in a moment of desperation. What do you think? Do you sympathize with Karen, or do you believe she deserves the punishment she faces? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear from you. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales that explore the complexities of human emotions and the choices that shape our lives.